Hi, everybody. Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, March 6th. My name is Heather Kraus, and I am very, very happy that you have joined us today for Talking Data Equity. We have a very cool special guest. Talking Data Equity is an informal drop-in event that my organization, We All Count, hosts most Fridays. I'm going to put a link in the chat where you can find out who's coming or what topics we're having for each Friday. And we've been doing this for almost 5 years, and the Zoom link has stayed the same for those 5 years. And so if you've found your way here, you can find your way here again any Friday, and we would love for you to join us. The only thing we guarantee is that every Friday is different. We have different topics, different speakers, and the idea behind Talking Data Equity is to make sure that you have a fresh flow of examples and tools and ideas about how to align the work that you're doing with data with your community priorities. And this edition, we have a very special guest that I'm very excited about. And if you ever see a guest or topic that you want to interact with or listen to, but you can't attend on that particular day, we do record it and we share the recordings in our data equity forum. I've just shared a link there as well. So I'm going to introduce our very special guest now. And how this works is that after I do the introduction, I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to share about his work, which is very exciting. And while he's doing that initial sharing and slides and some video, we are going to ask that you keep your microphone turned off. Use the Zoom chat, share all the reflections, ask all the questions you want on an ongoing basis in the Zoom chat. And then if there is time at the end, we will have a microphone on discussion, reflections, and questions and answers. All right. So today's special guest is somebody that I have been a fan of for a long time. We were chatting just before this, trying to remember exactly what year it was we met, and neither one of us can remember, but we know it's been a long time. And this is my friend Jonathan Gray, and he explores the role of digital data methods and infrastructure and how they shape how we live together and know things. And he's got a really fantastic new book called Public Data Cultures that came out just at the end of last year, 2025. And at King's College, he is a reader in critical infrastructure studies at the Department of Digital Humanities and the co-director for the Center for Digital Culture. He is also, and this is maybe where we first met, the co-founder of the Public Data Lab and a research associate at the University of Amsterdam in the Digital Methods initiative. And he has taught what is very cool, the School for Poetic Computation in New York City. And he has a really nice website, and we will put links to all of that, including the book, into both the Zoom chat, and it'll accompany the recording when we share it in our data equity forum. So Jonathan, thank you so much for, first of all, writing the book. It's very cool. And for coming to share your work with us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. And to everyone at We All Count for the invitation to join you today. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to join today. The work of this community has been an ongoing source of inspiration. And I was saying earlier, just before we started today, that Heather's work on data biographies has also been really a sort of important source of inspiration, particularly for the last chapter of the book, where it's mentioned, I think in page 122, for anyone who's curious. But as I don't know everyone here, I thought I'd also briefly provide some context around myself and my work. So I'm Jonathan Gray, and I use my middle initials, W and Y, as there are many Jonathan Grays out there. It's a very common name. I started making lists of some of the Jonathan Grays on the internet, and there are Jonathan Grays who do nursing and social work and ceramics and boxing and design. And I get emails from some of them. We email each other because we get each other's mail. So there's a kind of cultural researcher and a comic book artist, and we've spoken about doing some kind of collaboration together. Um, I In thinking about people who share names, I'm inspired by this project by this filmmaker, Grace Lee, who went to go and meet all of the people who shared her name, Grace Lee, and that brought her to Grace Lee Boggs. I don't know if any of you know Grace Lee Boggs, but she was an organizer and activist, and there was a wonderful film made about her in 2013. And I kind of wanted to start with some of Grace Lee Boggs's work because she confronts the many ways in which things in the US at that time and now are not working. So in the introduction to this book, it says, "We exist in a failed paradigm. How do we come out of these ashes?" And part of Grace Lee Boggs's response is what she calls rebuilding, redefining, and respiriting, whether through growing food in abandoned lots or community education initiatives or cooperatives and restorative justice. So I think, we don't need, especially at the moment, it's not new that things are not working. We face so many compounding and intersecting failures and oppressions and injustices. I don't need to persuade you that things are not working. And there are so many different troubles that we face, from climate catastrophe to biodiversity collapse and surging inequality and war, genocide, destruction, polycrises. And also, I'm sure I don't need to persuade you of the role of digital technologies and the roles they could play in extracting and exploiting and polluting and surveilling, um, bordering and destroying. You've heard all of this before. So I wanted to start with um, this question from Grace Lee Boggs, which is, what might rebuilding and redefining and what she calls respiriting look like in the current moment? And what role might data and digital technologies play? And can we imagine arrangement of data and computation that could help to nourish and replenish social and ecological relations? And in this, we can draw inspiration from many places, from feminist approaches to decolonial and indigenous thought and practice, towards remaking social relations and thinking about the role of data and computational systems in relations which might be more regenerative and equitable. So, no biggie, especially when things are at the moment. This is feeling like quite a, you know, an intimidating thing to think about. But so this is, I guess, the background to the work that I'm doing. I guess it kind of starts from the notion that many things are not working. We face many different forms of trouble. I'm interested in my research and my practice how digital technologies might nurture care and solidarity and imagination rather than exploitation, alienation, and harm, which is, of course, much easier said than done. And broadly speaking, my work kind of explores, studying data and methods and infrastructures, both as things to critically study as well as of intervention, including through creative engagements with data and digital technologies. So, as Heather mentioned, I'm working as a researcher in London. I co-founded this lab, which is a network of different research centres who do collaborative work with artists and civil society groups, journalists, culture institutions, and others. And it kind of aims to be a sort of mushroom network of learning and exchange across different classrooms and places. And also, it's been important to me spending time with communities such as the School of Poetic Computation, which is an experimental art school in New York, supporting study with code and critical theory. So that's a little bit of a quick background to me and the book. So the book, in a nutshell, explores how data is made public in the age of the internet, and it aims to nurture critical and creative engagements with data as cultural material, as medium of participation and a site of transnational politics. So the book started life over 15 years ago. So it's been a while, and it's really nice to see it out in the world and having a life of its own. I thought today I could do a quick walkthrough of the book and to read some little parts of it just to give you a sense of what it's about and why it might be, I guess, connected to some of the things that we're working on. So I'll start by reading a little bit from the introduction. You press play on the video. It shows a figure moving his hands across an illuminated screen of bright bubbles. He paces back and forth between an animated projection and a podium from which he configures the display. The bubbles are countries and the trajectories indicate trends over centuries. As they move, the man speaks of wars and revolutions, economic booms and epidemics, carbon emissions, and everyday life. This is public data culture, or shared practices and arrangements for making meaning, inviting engagement, and orienting action with data that is often freely available, digital, and related to shared matters of concern. This scene is one kind of public data culture, and there are many others, from collaborative spreadsheets reporting harassment, to viral global warming graphics, to apps for counting butterflies, to decolonial countermaps, and artworks which use data to display censorship. These kinds of projects shape how we know and how we live together. So while the word data comes from Latin datum, which means given, or what is given to us, data should not be taken for granted. And the book advocates for critical engagement with practices and arrangements through which data becomes public and supports reimagining public data cultures beyond dominant modes of display. So a lot has been written about making data in the sense of examining the creation of numbers, statistics, and data sets. So, for example, for a long time, there have been different understandings of joblessness or not having a job, but making unemployment into a number, of course, requires a lot of institutional work and advocacy and interventions. And the same is true of trying to give a number to carbon emissions or gender inequalities or other things. So each of these numbers has its own like conventions, its own histories. Of course, we can think about Heather's work on data biographies, right? You can tell the story of these numbers. So these different numbers reflect different ideas about what matters, how things can be measured, and how data can shape action. Not taking these numbers for granted means unflattening them or telling their story and understanding how they were made, whether through ethnographies or journalism or archives. So that's making making data, but there are also different ways of making data public. And making things public involves arrangements for organizing relationships. So if you think of like mixtapes or film festivals, they involve particular kinds of social and technical arrangements for making and sharing things. And if we look at the histories of making and sharing data, we see also histories of bureaucracy and of empire, of propaganda, information policy, design, activism, and many other things. And ways of making data public have shifted from like pamphlets and atlases and exhibitions, as you see in some of these pictures, to software and servers and screens. So not taking these arrangements for granted means unfolding them or looking closely at what is involved in making meaning through these kinds of projects, inviting engagement and orienting action. So what it means to make data public is the result of these kinds of social and technological processes which deserve to be scrutinized, especially amidst the rise of platforms and big tech and AI. And I guess part of what the book is doing is to kind of look carefully at how things are made public and how this might be kind of critically reworked. So there's a long-standing notion in hacker culture that information wants to be free, right? That we can liberate data through removing barriers and obstacles. And in this kind of understanding, what it means to make data public is often understood as removing restrictions, um, rather than looking at what must be present for data to meaningfully make a difference. So this kind of notion of opening up data has been, um, arisen in the context of scientists and artists and technologists and others calling for removing restrictions. It kind of went mainstream in policy contexts at the UN, at the World Bank, and at many kind of local and city and national governments around the world. And there are different ideas about what matters, from economic growth to democracy, participation, justice. Um, I guess there is agreement on the idea that data should be available for anyone to use for any purpose, which can be, in a sense, considered a form of liberalizing data, which unfortunately can end up empowering the empowered, according to critics, or supporting big technology companies, right? And there's a lot that's been written about this. So I guess the book is kind of starting with this idea that like focusing on removing restrictions is not enough. We also have to think about gathering collectives for whom data is meaningful, cultivating capacities, investing in infrastructures, and caring for the arrangements that mean that data can make a difference. So in this view, data is more than like a resource just to be unlocked. It's also something that involves practices and arrangements for making and sharing in the age of the internet. So the first part of the book invites like reconsideration of what data is and what it means for data to be made public. And here, I guess I'm thinking of reconsideration as looking again, looking carefully, paying close attention, and slowing down and paying attention to details. And I think in reconsidering public data, we find it's more than just like facts which point to things. And I guess the three chapters at the beginning of the book aim to like, I guess, add layers to how we think about what it means to make data and to make data public. And the second part of the book looks at different ways that we can critically engage data, drawing inspiration from many different kinds of communities of practice and many different kinds of approaches to kind of critical reflection. So the book is intended to like feed imagination about how we work with data rather than starting from scratch. How might we take the kinds of arrangements that we have for making data and for analyzing data and creatively rework them with different kinds of values and sensibilities. And I guess in that sense, the book is meant to kind of feed practice, which can be creative and purposeful and situationally attuned. And the book as a whole, I guess, draws inspiration from work like, I don't know if any of you know, Mindy Su's wonderful book, The Cyber Feminism Index. Here, Mindy Su draws on the science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin, who contrasts like hunting and gathering. So hunting is like looking ahead, and gathering is like looking around, right? Looking around more carefully for inspiration rather than just this kind of narrow focus. It's kind of looking at breadth and relations and many different situations. So I guess the book is, in the sense, it's not like a program. It's more like aiming to add layers to practice by looking around carefully. And in the sense, it hopes to kind of feed creative and critical engagement with the data. So I'll read a little bit from the first chapter. Scrolling through the feed, there are hundreds of pastel-colored drawings with handwritten captions. Small pictures of people, creatures, and objects are organized into graphs and overlaid with numbers and captions. Queues of people spreading over many images represent millions of Palestinians displaced from their homes. Stacked Amazon boxes highlight discrepancies between corporate profits and taxes paid. Hands in handcuffs contrast the arrests of white supremacists and Black Lives Matter protesters. Rainbows represent the sizes of donations to homophobic politicians from companies that celebrate pride. This is the Instagram account of data journalist Mona Chalabi, who I'm sure many of you know. She works creatively with public data as cultural material to display inequalities, contextualize current events, and probe patterns of everyday life. And her pieces aim to make data meaningful, relatable, and engaging in ways that don't require advanced statistical knowledge or computational expertise. Mona's work shows how data does more than represent things. Data can be understood as collections of elements whose arrangements can become meaningful in different ways. So public data projects, as you know, translate the shape of data sets, like rows and columns and relations, into charts, colors, sounds, and other kinds of interfaces, often drawing on conventions of pre-digital formats. So in this sense, these sorts of projects assemble media and materials into hybrid compositions for counting, calculating, interpreting, showing, listening, and witnessing. So I guess one of the things that I want to do in this chapter is just look across many different ways of making data meaningful through arrangement. So like lists and tables and relational databases and visualizations, sketching, sculpture, and sound. And I guess part of the idea here is to look at the different histories of these ways of making data meaningful and think more broadly about how data might be communicated and translated, but also modified in digital environments. It looks at, for example, listing as a kind of everyday practice, but also an institutional practice and an activist practice, as in the case of lists used and shared by investigative journalists. It looks at the histories and cultures of spreadsheeting, from like paper-based accounting through to the emergence of like VisiCalc and Excel, and then through to like Google Doc activism on things like pay discrepancies and sexual harassment and missing people and mass layoffs and unfair employment policies. So what interests me here is things like how network spreadsheets like Google Docs can serve as sites where publics come together and issues are articulated through working with these interfaces and software packages and data flows and servers and network protocols. And the chapter also looks at different ways of making data into material, as in the case of like knitting, excess working hours, or threads showing migration routes or air pollution. There's a lot of projects on air pollution, which can be displayed through things like balloons or necklaces or patterns of light or clouds of mist or knots inspired by ancient Andean string patterns. So it also looks at like ways of translating data into sound. And I guess, yeah, the point of this chapter is to draw much more widely on different ways of making sense with data, and to tell some of the other kinds of stories of like cultural practices which are used to make data meaningful. And the purpose of this is to look beyond like familiar forms of ordering data and arranging data that often come from commercial or administrative contexts, to think how else data might serve as a medium of collective understanding and collective attunement. So that was the first chapter. The second chapter is looking at data as a medium of participation. So I'll read a little bit from that. On the screen, there is a map and a box inviting you to type in an address. You type in your address and the screen zooms into a blocky model of your neighborhood, speckled with green dots. You click on a dot and a tree information panel pops up. You have selected a 67-year-old linden tree. You're invited to log in and to adopt this tree and water it during the summer droughts. There is a button and you can click to say that you have watered it. A graph shows recent rainfall and waterings from other users. And another panel shows you an overview of trees in the city, as well as their species, waterings, and adoptions. This is an example of public data as medium of participation. Data from a city portal has been incorporated into an open source web application, inviting residents to take part in looking after trees in their neighborhood. So stepping back, participation means to take part in, to give part in, or to be part of. And it implies being in relation to something or being part of something with others. And this, of course, can include and exclude, place into the foreground and relegate into the background. And data can be used to like structure the past in the present to shape how we act in the future and incline different kinds of forms of response. And these kinds of projects also embed miniature models of the world through their interfaces and infrastructures. So many of you will probably know this project, Adopt a Hydrant. I don't know if you remember this, but it was kind of quite a widely shared project from, I can't remember, like maybe at least 15 years ago, I guess. So it was created in response to winter snowstorms, which would cover up hydrants. And of course, um, you know, hydrants are needed to put out fires. So the project invited users to shovel out the hydrants after snow. And there's also a button which you could click to remind people who volunteered to get shoveling. This comes from like a longer history of like adopt kind of schemes. So like adopt a park, adopt roads, and yeah, it's a kind of interesting mix of things going on here because on the one hand, um, there is forms of kind of involvement and participation which are invited to these projects. But also you can read them in the context of strained budgets and budget cuts and kind of austerity and kind of shifts to kind of public-private partnerships. So one of the things I did in this chapter was like trace, for example, in the case of Adopt a Hydrant, like how this model had traveled and been used. So you can see, as well as Adopt a Hydrant, you can see it being used to encourage users to adopt trees and dumpsters and sidewalks and trash cans and bus shelters. So this is kind of forking of the code into many other kinds of adopter schemes. And you also see people, as well as adopting the software, like adopting the interface features. So this is a project where you can see anthropomorphization of the hydrant into friendly characters. So this is hydrant number 36, who's called Sparky, who says, I've been adopted by Hoidal. They're taking care of me this winter. And there are lots of other hydrants that need adoption. If you can't take care of me anymore, then please abandon me. And you can see this is poor Sparky who's been abandoned. In which case the user receives a message that says, you have successfully abandoned your hydrant. Have a warm and safe winter. Sparky will be lonely without you. And then there's Sparky waving goodbye with a tear coming out of his eye. So care is complicated, as Maria Poydilla Bellicasa notes. Invitations to care can be transformative or problematic. Care is complicated, and this is also true of these kinds of applications. So governments may defund local services and ask already overburdened and overworked residents to step in and kind of pick up what governments were previously doing through services. So apps can connect you with your neighbors as well as enmeshing corporate technologies into arrangements of responsibility. And I think it's, they may genuinely be hopeful demonstrations of collective responsiveness as well as potentially masking systemic issues and problems. So I guess the chapter is kind of trying to unpack that a little bit and look at different invitations to repurpose data, to make data, from corporate events to feminist gatherings to different forms of data witnessing. it looks at things like the desocialization. Oops, play slow video. So that was the UK's kind of data portal, and you can see over time the kind of social features get stripped out, and it becomes more and more um, kind of like an official register. I spent a long time looking at these different kinds of uh, projects and how they configure participation, including in unexpected ways. So this is uh, inspired by the work of Mimi Onuoha, a data set of data sets which were sought but not found on portals around the world. So it's looking at things that unsuccessful requests or things that people came looking for but couldn't find, or where data sets were not published. And I guess I find this interesting as it shows some of the different ways in which data comes to matter, as well as inviting reflection on which kinds of data sets are not collected or made public, and which kinds of questions remain unanswerable as a result. And I also looked at things like, OpenStreetMap, which I'm sure many of you know, the histories of how OpenStreetMap evolved and which kinds of features are included and rejected, and the kind of politics of that, which has been studied quite a bit, and also things like the circulation and cultures of data making devices, like sensing devices, air pollution monitoring devices through platforms and forums and mailing lists and archives. So the third, I guess, layer to reconsidering data is looking at how data projects can be ways of coordinating across countries, right? So often, sometimes they're local or national, but often data projects involve transnational coordination and exchange, and cross-border communities of practice. And they can be viewed as kind of multi-layered, and sometimes, contentious sites of trying to exchange and coordinate across countries where different kinds of visions of world making play out. So the chapter looks at how this works in practice, like how cross-border exchange plays out through things like events, documents, assessment devices, and cross-border data projects. We didn't mention at the beginning, actually, at the moment, it's just coming up to Open Data Day, right? And so one of the things that it looks at is hashtags, and like the Open Data Day hashtag as a way of kind of coordinating around data across countries. And I guess here it sort of looks at those different forms of coordination in the history, in relation to histories of like coordinating across countries, including, histories of colonization and outsourcing and offshore finance. So the chapter is also asking whether and how data might also help to dismantle systems of extraction, and these kinds of extractive systems, as well as grow other kinds of ways of relating across countries and other forms of interdependence. Which brings us to the second part of the book, which is on different ways of critically engaging with data. And it starts with a chapter on missing data and making data. I already briefly mentioned this wonderful project from Mimi Onuoha, the Library of Missing Datasets, which explores patterns of absence in an increasingly machine-readable world. And I guess many of you will be familiar with the idea of things like data gaps, right? Or what kinds of data is missing. I think the starting point for this chapter is data becomes missing. Like it takes work to establish that data is missing, as I'm sure many of you know. Like it's not just that there is some scheme of what's important and we can measure things in relation to that, right? Like that's fixed. Like what data is considered important also changes over time and is something that's shaped also by struggle and by work and by care and by what activists and community groups and civil society groups do, and the kinds of things that they make the case it's important to measure and pay attention to, which also changes. So this chapter looks at how data in different areas, the work that's required to show data is missing, and then also how activists, journalists, and others make data in response to data which is missing. And there are like three projects that I kind of go in to look at in more detail. One is on police killings, another is on multinational tax avoidance, and another is on coal power plants. And each of these projects in different ways require kind of imagination to understand and reverse engineer and develop arrangements which are often layered, involve multiple organizations, and can often be distributed rather than just being like, for example, a single database project within an organization. These are often quite creative projects in that way. And I think they're interesting because they raise questions about what kinds of data should exist, for what and for whom. I guess just to give one very quick illustration of this, I find it fascinating. I'm sure many of you know, like the Guardian's Counted project and projects like it, like the Washington Post and many other media organizations over a long period have done work in this area, counting people who are killed by police in the United States, which is, the starting point is there is no official record, which is kind of shocking and crazy. And the response is to try and gather together records and reports and understand like how many people are killed by police. So the Guardian did this by like building on the work of many activist groups who were already counting these incidents in various ways. The thing that I find strange is, so the Guardian do this project, there's other media organizations do these kinds of projects. Then the US Department of Justice set up its own system, which was described as being nearly identical to the one that the Guardian created. So having like social media monitoring and sort of verification, which had the consequence at the time that the US government basically drew upon this kind of third party system of journalists and activists reporting on police killings rather than going through official channels, which is like a really weird kind of way of embedding activists' infrastructures into kind of government reporting systems at that time. So the final chapter is on critical data practices. And these are different ways of working which aim to bring critical reflections about data into ways of working with it, which draw inspiration from many places and communities of practice, including this one. So there's a mention of the work of Heather and others in sort of this chapter. So in the spirit of cultivating and growing imagination around these kinds of critical engagement data, the chapter contains like a little lexicon. So it's like a little book within a book, seeing what can be learnt from approaches which have been described as decolonial, feminist, indigenous, queer, slow, warm, weird, and more. So each of these little sections in the lexicon reviews both practices and approaches and examples of projects associated with each of these terms. So, for example, this could be, in the case of sceneful data, trying to like foreground what is left out and abandoned and erased from data systems, drawing inspiration from things like fabric seams and pottery repair practices. If we have time, I was going to show like a very brief couple of clips. Yeah, this is on speculative data practices. This is a little project by Tega Brain and Sam Levine, which uses data as a speculative medium for what they call kind of expanded geoengineering. So this is a project in which you see bots clicking on ads in climate news in order to artificially inflate its value. So the bots click on the ads in climate news to like make it more valuable. So this is the first one.
Scroll, click, click, click.
So you get the idea. And another piece from Maya Livio. So there's a chapter on queering data, which is both looking at kind of representations of queer community, also queering data as troubling or not taking for granted demographic characteristics and forms of representation. So it's kind of complicating how marginalized communities are represented in data. And I wanted to show this work from Maya Livio, from her work on salvaging birds, which is also looking at that's not just people. There's also creatures and more than humans in this kind of area. So this is a bit of her work on queering bird data sets, which explores the absences of female and intersex birds in these kinds of official collections of like bird song and kind of natural history databases. And she's both performing and troubling what it might mean to write these absent birds back into the picture through like speculative data sets. I'll show you. Okay, I think I'll kind of wrap up there. In conclusion, I guess the book aims to be a kind of source book, nourishing thinking and critical practice around data as a cultural material, as medium of participation, as a site of transnational politics or doing things across countries. And it aims to invite imagination about the roles that data can play beyond many things that we're familiar with, like polluting data centers, exploited platform workers, extractive technology companies, and surveillance industrial complexes, and how data might be used in ways which are more hopeful and inventive and expressive and potentially regenerative, and which might both help to articulate some of the troubles of our times in more sophisticated and nuanced ways, as well as maybe supporting other ways of living together. And that's it. Yeah, it'll be really nice to keep in touch with many of you here. I've joined the forum, the Wheel Count forum, and I really look forward to kind of being in touch with you there. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Hopefully, you can see on the screen a tremendous amount of appreciation. That talk was exactly what we needed today. It was,
Yes.
yeah, any chance the book will be available as an audiobook. I was thinking the very same thing when I was listening. There is, that would be amazing. Is there any chance? Are you turning this book into an audiobook?
Well, I can pass the suggestion along to the publisher. That's a really sweet suggestion.
Yeah, it was fantastic to hear you read and illustrate some of it. My copy of the book is already like pages are thumbed down. There's all different colors of post-its and bookmarks all throughout the book. So I think that your idea of making it, I can't remember your exact word you said, but like a resource that you would return to over and over and over. Absolutely. It is that kind of a book. So I highly recommend you folks getting a copy. Jonathan, should I share that discount code?
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
okay. We
Yeah.
have a discount code if you want to get a copy of the book before it's before it's an audiobook. We'll let you know when it's an audiobook. But that discount code should work. Let us know if you have any trouble, but it should work on the Wiley homepage. And if you are in the room and want to ask Jonathan a question or share a reflection, now is your opportunity to turn your microphone on. You can either just turn your microphone on, or if you want to raise your Zoom hand in the reaction section, you can. And while people decide if they want to turn their mic on and ask a question, I'm going to amplify some questions from the chat. And the first is no surprise to me. Several people want to know whether you made the cover art, because it's just as gorgeous as everything else in the book. Is that yours?
No, that was thank you so much. I really yeah, I lost my dad a few years ago.
Oh,
And I'm sort of still yeah, I've been uh grieving him, and I think one of the things I used
oh,
to do with him was go to he was from, so my mum's Asian American from San Francisco and grew up there in the 60s with kind of community organizing, and then met my dad, and he was from Scotland. I used to go and visit his family in Scotland, and there was an art gallery we used to go to, and there was an Italian artist called Edoardo Paolozzi, who was also a public artist. He did tube stations in London as well, but that piece of work is from Paolozzi, and it's kind of it's sort of he was working in the 60s, but he was an artist who engaged with kind of computation quite early on. So I thought somehow it was a nice image for just kind of thinking about growing the repertoire of what we think about when we think about data a little bit.
wow.
Yeah.
What a beautiful story. Every
Mm.
part of this book has so much meaning and intentionality and thoughtfulness.
Yeah.
It's really a quite cohesive piece of culture. So that is a great story, and it does not surprise me that the every part of the book is
Mm.
amazing. Um, all right, let me look through some other questions here in the chat. Um,
Ah,
yeah,
I
go
just
ahead.
noticed some funny some sweet coincidences. One is Mariama is mentioning the white collar crime
Oh
uh
yeah, yeah, yeah.
project, and
Okay.
that is from Sam Levine, who was one of the people who worked with Tega Brain on the synthetic botnet project. So there's a little
Great.
kind of loop there. The other thing that I notice is uh, Najmul Chowdhury
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
very kindly highlighted the data journalism handbooks, which that was one of the things that I edited with Liliana Brunegru, the data journalism handbook. I've just put a link in the chat towards a critical data practice, which includes chapters on feminist approaches to data, indigenous process, indigenous approaches to data, and indigenous data sovereignty. And it has a lot of really nice examples in it, and that's been another important sort of community to think along with for this book too. So,
Totally agree.
mm, mm. Oh,
This is,
yes,
yes.
yes.
There's a lot of appreciation here.
Yeah.
Jonathan, thank you so much. You really are an amazing person. Um,
Yeah.
I'm going to amplify one of the other questions from the chat, which is can you say a little bit more about the example that you showed? Actually, two examples. One was that UK open data, where we saw the video go from like a really grassroots platform to something that was clearly quite um, I don't really know the right word for it, bureaucratic or sterile, and um, a government thing. And then you talked about the same thing with the police. You know, it went from community informed, and then it went to the media, and then it went to the government. Can you say a little bit more about what you've learned about those kind of transitions, and whether there is a way to try and anchor them in the community, or is that even an intention that we should work towards?
100%. That's such a great question, and such a I'm really glad that yeah, that was picked up on that kind of and I think it also relates a little bit to your work on data biographies. Like understanding how data is a relationship, and data involves translation. And I guess one of the things I'm kind of hoping with the book is to kind of open up imagination for thinking about how uh, data is a medium of relating to issues. And with collectives, it's not only a medium for experts, it's also a kind of, it can be a collective medium. And I really like, for example, some of the examples of spreadsheeting as a collective medium of giving shape and finding resonances and continuities and experiences, not just measuring.
Mm.
Um, and I think there's something important there about keeping alive to the circumstances in which data can be important, and keeping alive to the ways in which it's used, and using more of the range when it comes to thinking of data as culture and um, as a medium of involvement. And in everything from like thinking about how different forms of visualizations can also connect to forms of play and counting and like toys and colors and murals. There's a lot of really exciting work in this area, but I think just continuing to try and to use the full range and to be imaginative about how um, data can be a living medium that connects issues and those affected by those issues to forms of collective response. Um, I guess, yeah, that would be my hope. And I think it's hard because there is this it can happen that um, data sets become abstracted from those circumstances and communities. In the case of, for example, the UK's data portal, there is a sort of desocialization where the
Yes.
interactive features sort of disappear. And I think, it's hard because the invitations to take part don't always work out the way that you expect. But I still feel like there's a case to be made for kind of keeping those forums and forms and spaces open. And I think the looking at the data requests that didn't work out for me is a really clear case of why there's so much learning that can happen in these spaces, but not necessarily in the way that you would expect. So it's not necessarily through people like using data and winning a competition or creating a new app. It can also be through people having questions and concerns that data doesn't address, but which is still somehow important. Um,
Really, really well put. In order to really do inclusive work, you have to let go of some control.
yes, exactly. Yeah,
You
yeah,
don't get to be together and completely in control at the same time.
yeah. No, exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, on that note, we will wrap up to respect everyone's time. Jonathan and I didn't plan this, but it is, I guess, officially in many countries Open Data Day tomorrow. So the overlap is fantastic. We put a link here in the chat to Open Data Day. And Jonathan, I cannot thank you enough for being who you are and doing the deep, deep, expansive work that you do, and then being willing to spend time and share it with us. It was a fantastic time today. We'll put all of the materials, including, yes, the links to all of the beautiful books, into the Data Equity Forum. It'll be there for you folks. And we are actually not here next Friday. I'm traveling next Friday, but we're here in 2 weeks with Evelyn McCoy, who is going to talk to us about data in prisons. So we've had a lot of requests for that, and we're really looking forward to it. But Jonathan, thank you from the bottom of all of our hearts for spending time with us today and reminding us how important the day by day approach to our data work is. I really appreciate it.
And thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to seeing you on the forum. I'm there for those on the forum.
Great.
And look forward to following your work and keeping in touch.
Yes, me
Thank
too. And to everybody who came today, thank you for being here, taking care of each other, taking care of yourselves, and happy Open Data Day. Bye, everybody.
you.